Hello, everyone, and welcome to BugCrowd's webinar, 5 Critical Security Issues for 2017 and How to Address Them. My name is Paul Ross. I am the SVP of Marketing here at BugCrowd, and I'm really pleased to be able to join you alongside a real guru panel that we have here today with a CISO, an app security guru, and an IoT security expert, really to provide some industry perspective on what's been happening in security and what's emerged over the last year and what we can look forward to in 2017. And as I said, I'm really honored to have the panel of experts that we have with us today. With Jeremiah Grossman, the founder of WhiteHat Security and Chief of Security Strategy with SentinelOne. Daniel Miessler, project leader of the OWASP IoT Security Project, and Richard Rushing, CISO at Motorola Mobility. So we're going to be walking through a discussion really of what the trends the panel has seen and just walking through a couple of topics that we think are important in terms of what we're doing in 2017. For those of you who are not familiar with BugCrowd, BugCrowd is an enterprise bug bounty and hackers on demand provider. Our platform exists to connect organizations to the worldwide researcher community for bug bounties, both private and public, and to meet the specific needs of application security testing and other emerging areas within crowdsourced security. We have over 40,000 researchers on our platform, and we use our platform to connect them to the variety of different programs that our clients have in terms of these bug bounty models, both big with organizations like MasterCard and smaller emerging companies as well. The goal that we have is to connect that crowd using a kind of curated model that allows the crowd to act like an adversary, but act like an ally as well to find vulnerabilities within our organization's platforms, and then provide those organizations with a very simple way for them to connect to those researchers to manage their program, but also to provide the deep expertise to design, support, and manage those programs on an ongoing basis. So now that we have the introductions out of the way, we'll move on to the core things that we've been facing over the last year and into 2017. So I'll open this up to the panel in a moment, but I think it's fair to say that 2016 was the year of the breach in terms of cybersecurity, certainly from a media perspective. I did some research in the last couple of days looking at the number of breaches, and I think this is definitely underreporting them. But where those organizations who were kind of forced to publicly talk about breaches that they had in terms of customer identity theft, there was almost 1,000 breaches in 2016, and over 35 million records were exposed through those breaches, which is clearly a very big challenge for the security industry to address. And then you take into account all of the issues that we had around the election, that we had in terms of some of the social sites that were also hacked and information revealed. So it's a really interesting year in terms of that particular issue. And there's a great tweet that one of our panelists, Jeremiah, put out as we were finishing up the cybersecurity month earlier this year, pointing out how interesting an experience it was to have that month in the context of all of those breaches. So if I turn to our panel, I'll start with Jeremiah because as you were quoted on the site, and give me a sense, I guess, or the audience a sense of what you saw in 2016 and what you thought was important, especially in the context of all of these very high-profile breaches that we saw.
Absolutely, and I guess first let me say thank you for having me. Thank you for all the attendees that listened to us here today, and hopefully it should be a good conversation. So yeah, every year we say this year is the year of the breach. I've heard this term in 2016, I heard it in 2015, 14, 13, and as far back as I care to remember. And it seems every year we get a record number of breaches exposed, number of breaches, biggest breaches, and unfortunately for the world, 2016 was no different. And in the Cybersecurity Awareness Month was back in October. We had one of the largest breaches ever on record in terms of records, and that was Yahoo, from what we understand. We had the largest DDoS in recorded history at just about 1.2 terabytes, and we called that Mirai. So something has to change. We seem to, and let me step back, and then we look at all these breaches and we go, was there anything new under the sun? Was there some kind of new vulnerability we weren't aware of, a type of attack that we couldn't be prepared for? And it seems to be the case. We know everything about these particular vulnerabilities, how to find them, how to fix them, how to react to them. But for some reason, we don't have the proper market incentives in line for dealing with these breaches. So for myself, I think a lot of times what we run into is not so much a lack of money, resources, or even know-how, just a lack of incentives to get the right people to do the right thing at the right time to stop these things. So we know what to do. It's just we have to do them already.
I think it's a really good point. Richard, as a CISO, how do you kind of address what Jeremiah was just saying there in terms of we seem to know what we need to do to address these challenges, but we're not necessarily able to do that. As a CISO, how do you approach some of those challenges?
No, I think from the challenges perspective, anytime that you're dealing with the internet, it's not getting safer. We would love for it to wake up and, hey, the internet has become a safer place. Connectivity has become, it's kind of keeps the snowball rolling down the hill scenario. It keeps gathering more and more and more stuff. And as Jeremiah pointed out, we're not standing still. We're trying to fix things as a moving target as we're continually going down the road in an automobile and we're doing major repair work on it as we're driving. And so this becomes very difficult, not only to get ahead of the game and try to be proactive about it, but the secondary thing of what we know about and what we're trying to do, there's just not enough resources, and that could be time, that could be money, that can be people, that can be areas of focus. We kind of always look at, we want to do things, but we also have to remember that technology is just one portion of the solution and around this. There is the people portion and the process portion that has to be addressed at the same time. And I think those are kind of some of the reasons why we don't take on some of the challenges that are there, is because it's a big people or process problem. And those are hard to fix, a lot harder to fix than sometimes a technology problem.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting point there, Richard. We talk a lot here at BugCrowd around this kind of cycle that's happening where, the attack surface is growing and the bad actors who are out there, that's a very established economy that's growing as well. And to Jeremiah's point around the incentive part of it. But then we have the reality of the staffing and people available to actually, and skills available to deal with some of these things on the inside of the firewall. Daniel, in terms of your perspective as somebody who's been working a lot on kind of industry-level initiatives, how did you see 2016 in terms of whether we improved our posture or it got worse for us?
Yeah, I think it definitely got worse. I mean, I think the bad news is that it's not one cause, it's actually multiple causes. I think attackers are systematizing the way they attack companies a lot faster than defenders systematize their defense. And that includes better tools, better processes, stuff like that. The other thing is attack just has more on their side, right? It's far easier to go into like a deserted part of Detroit at 4 a.m. and like steal a car than it is to make Detroit a safe place, right? And that is a big problem. On top of that, you have new surface area like being shoveled on, as someone mentioned already. You also have the conversion of computers like into things. It's crazy. So instead of things having computers in them, things just become computers, and that's going to be a problem. I mean, that's IoT in a nutshell. But finally, I think the biggest thing is potentially that we're just reporting better. I mean, what if our data capture is increasing faster than even the attacks are increasing, which of course are increasing faster than the defense. So it could be that we're conflating better data with more attacks, but I actually think both are happening.
Very good point. And I think that your issue that you raised there fits nicely with our discussion of our what we see as the first trend in 2017, with IoT security becoming, really every CISO's problem, whether they're an IoT company specifically or not. Because I think if you think about the use of connected devices, both in the consumer world, and in the corporate world. It's really an important thing for people to be thinking about, and it's a really strong new attack surface that not many people are as prepared for. So Daniel, I know that you've been working a lot on IoT as a subject area. What's your thoughts on maybe how we can solve some of those problems from a CISO perspective?
I think CISO-wise, I mean, the key thing is understanding what gets put into an environment, right? I mean, I think a lot of systems are being deployed when they don't know how all the components link together. I mean, an IoT deployment often includes the device itself, some web application sitting on the device, a mobile application connecting to the device, cloud functionality, obviously network traffic, right? And how many people are actually looking at all these different facets, plus the additional surface area of all of them combined, and then doing some sort of risk analysis and saying, okay, now we're going to put it in. That's not really what happens. What happens is they say, I heard it does this thing, let's drop it on the network. So I think until we start having deeper analysis, which might happen very, very distant point in the future, you kind of have to segment. You have to separate these systems from what you consider to be critical to whatever degree that you can.
Thanks. And Richard, in terms of as a CISO, what's your perspective on how to address some of the challenges of IoT? Obviously, at Lenovo, you are, without minimizing what you do, a device company as much as anything else. So how do you and your colleagues think about this new emerging attack surface of the threats that can come from IoT, and also maybe some of the ways that you're approaching dealing with those threats?
No, I think it's an interesting dilemma, for lack of a better term, to look, because again, IoT is coming really fast into a marketplace that's there, and part of that is definitely driven by a consumerization of IT. We saw it with wireless devices and along those same lines. It's being driven by the same consumerization. So you kind of have consumer-ready, enterprise-ready kind of environments. If I can do this here, why can't I do this at work? Becomes an argument in a lot of cases. The problem is a lot of times the consumerization side of it, these devices are kind of deemed as disposable. This gen of devices, version 1, we don't expect to do upgrades or patch or fix problems, because version 2 is going to come out next year, and you just buy version 2, and then you just buy version 3 and version 4, et cetera. With that, we'll kind of do the incremental fixing of these devices along those lines, because you're not going with, hey, this device is going to last 5 years or 10 years, and it needs to be able to be upgradable, fixable, et cetera, with that, because that adds a whole new problem into the solution of the side of that is just the cost. Now, where from an enterprise level this becomes kind of critical is typically the devices are not the big expense. The piece of hardware that I deploy is not the big expense. The big expense is the deployment itself. These devices need power. These devices need sometimes network connectivity. And in doing so, that means contractors, associations, et cetera, with that. So you can look at, hey, this $10 device may cost me, if I do outside deployment somewhere on a light pole or anything else, it may cost me $2,000 to do that deployment. And the disposability of that says, hey, this $15 device, when you get it next year, it'll be $12.50, yet it's still going to cost me $2,000 to deploy it. And this becomes a problematic thing for the enterprise level, where the deployment costs, no matter what I do, are going to be pretty astronomical in some cases with that. And the second thing is that hardware swap may never occur because of the cost associated in deployment. So now I'm running kind of the worst of the worst. I'm running insecure hardware that is not really designed, can fail, can be compromised, et cetera, with this in environments that are actually there. And the solution is not to necessarily just buy a new one. And I think the long-term side effects of this is that you're going to have to build hardware that is capable of being upgradable, that is capable of being flashable. You're going to have higher processors so you don't deal with the battery intensity issues and performance issues wrapped around some of the things of, hey, get a cheap processor and do this. Well, I can't do encryption. I can't do some other things because of the heavy lifting that's required on that. That has to end and move towards, hey, this hardware is going to be more expensive, but in the long term, it's going to be better for the industry and everything else because it is something that can be maintained for a longer period of time than the disposable characteristics of the IoT that we're seeing a lot today.
So some really interesting new models of how to address hardware within an environment from a CISO perspective that maybe hasn't been there in the past. Jeremiah, from your perspective, maybe more looking at this from a security vendor perspective, how do you think that we can help as an industry to resolve these? Obviously, from BugCrowd's perspective, I think there's a strong push towards, like, let's use the crowd as an instrument to help with some of these things because you're looking at such a wide variety of different types of devices, which is when the skills that we can offer as a crowd to deal with that. But what's your perspective as more from a vendor side about how we support solving some of these challenges?
It's a really good question. You know, one of the things that I look at that I don't think the other two gentlemen touched on is a lot of these devices are going to start coming certified pre-owned, if you like. They're going to have backdoors. They're going to have malware put on them by accident or on purpose. And how do we deal with that from a security concepts or security controls? We can try to isolate them off the network, but when they start reaching out because they already have malware on it, it's going to get very problematic. But from a vendor standpoint, those in CISO roles and different security leadership roles should be starting to demand from their vendors, IoT otherwise, for some kind of assurance, attestation, or liability that these devices have been tested, and if there's vulnerabilities, that they're going to get those patches out quickly. Because that's actually, I think, where we're going to suffer the most harm. I remember working in web security for many, many years, and by the time people really got serious about web security and application security, the web was already built. 1 billion websites strong, we said, okay, now it's time to find some vulns and fix them. And it became a large, really a problem that had to scale. It was just so big, like we can't just rewrite the web just because, to make it secure this time. And my concern is that we're going to see the same thing in IoT. We know all these vulnerabilities. We know memory handling issues. We know cross-site scripting. We know SQL injection and RCEs in all these devices. But by the time we really get serious about IoT security, there's going to be 10 billion of these devices on the network, and for all practical matters, unpatchable. And then what do we do then? So in the meantime, I like holding vendor seats to the fire on who sells these things to you.
I think that's a really good point in terms of again, emphasizes the difference in the type of hardware that you're acquiring or bringing into your network compared to what you're used to as a security team or even an IT team, because of the nature of the devices themselves are so fundamentally different than buying a server, buying a router, whatever it is that you're working on there. Especially as you point out there is the second-hand market, the pre-owned market is going to become a bigger issue as well. And Jeremiah, I'll stay with you to start off our next conversation here, which is really goes back to your point around a little bit maybe of the kind of website security, web in general security. I think we've made great steps over recent years to make the web more secure. It's obviously a big focus of what we do here at BugCrowd. But one of the areas that we have heard a lot of interesting discussion has been how pen testing evolves in organizations. We are obviously advocates of applying the crowd to solve some of those problems, but I'd love to hear your perspective on what organizations need to think about in terms of integrating a broader approach, I guess, to pen testing within their organizations.
So I've been following the bug bounty concept for well over 10 years now, and I saw it coming in 2007 and 8 because it's many economic advantages in terms of efficiency and quality of results. So what happens is, and the way it usually works out there even today, is that when companies start doing pen testing or vulnerability assessment, I'll use those terms synonymously here, you pay for pen tests, and you get a bucket of vulns, and you pay one flat fee for a week or two of work time that they have. And then that didn't scale so well, and it gave rise to a new model, the one I pioneered at WhiteHat, the software as a service model, where it was a flat fee for an annual term of service. And then that worked really well. But what happens is when you do the vulnerabilities per dollar ratio year over year, you pay one flat fee, you get a bucket of vulns, and you do the division, you get a ratio. But when the company gets more secure, they have less vulns, and the dollars you're paying per vuln starts to go up. And then you come to a point of time in AppSec maturity where you have very little vulns and you're able to fix them quickly. And the results that you're getting from, whatever the VA vendor is, the economics start pointing the other way towards bounty. So it makes bounty interesting, and why I was really going like, okay, this is the future for those that are starting to get really good at AppSec, or the maturity programs are good, is that you're only going to pay for results. You're not going to pay for them just doing work. You're only going to pay for vulns that you care about, and the economics start lending itself that direction, and which is what I account towards the success that bug bounty has had over the last 2 years. 2-3 years ago, you're going to find maybe a dozen, 2 dozen programs. Now you're going to find hundreds, maybe 1,000 or more, and it just took off all of a sudden because of the economics.
Richard, as a CISO who has experience with bug bounty programs and thinking about vulnerability assessment and pen testing, how does it fit within your overall kind of security posture and your approach? Why have you looked to this as a model that you think is going to be successful?
I think it becomes, as Jeremiah alluded to, it's kind of a very much as a maturity model that gets into it, that's there. As you start getting into, as you get your developments inside of it, you've gleaned off most of the sets of vulnerabilities that you can actually find, whether it's through internal resources or then you go out and hire somebody else to come in. They come in and give you some results. You may then try to go to a more boutique establishment that's experts in this field or a certain kind of application to give more results. And you get to this point where, like you said, you're not finding things, but you know that you're not perfect. Therefore, there's things that are there that may or not be testing with. And I think from a bug bounty perspective, being able to say, here's a swath of people that you can get. So you will get people that are very familiar with things such as shopping carts, API calls, authentication, and things that are the nature of glues that put things together, that even when environments are tested and come back and, hey, we've certified this, we've scanned this, we believe there's no issues and everything else, the bounty people can come back into the environment and still find issues with that. And it's part of the experience, but it's also part of a maturity model that they're capable of doing this either through previous work experience, previous pen testing experience, just previous experience in trying to do something around that. And it's also to the point that you can scale this. Again, it's back to the point of like, okay, I'm not going to have any of these. I want to pay for a lot of dollars, and we've seen some of these come out that says, hey, I'm looking for this, and these have come up, and so I'm looking for this kind of high dollar vulnerability, and lo and behold, somebody will spend the time and effort to create that on that. And we've seen those purchased on the black market side, but we've also seen companies and organizations have very strong success in saying, hey, here is something that we're willing to pay for. Please help us out and find this for us. And they've been found. It's not something that is like, oh, no one's claimed the prize. The prize has been claimed over and over again. And I think that's kind of the maturity model. As you're getting better and better with the pen testing, bounty programs are a requirement to be able to get into this environment that's actually there. And in some cases, the internal side becomes, hey, this is the next step of the model place. We'll just turn it over to this after we've gleaned all the vulnerabilities with it, put it into the bounty program and let her go and see what comes back on that side of it.
There's some really interesting things in there, Richard, in terms of the economics of the kind of defensive market for vulnerabilities, if you like, versus the offensive market. It's kind of interesting. We looked at, we just completed a CISO survey with 100 plus CISOs, and the key reason people were actually looking to invest in these programs was very much the things that you were highlighting there around, finding people with the variety of skills and approaches that you get in a crowd versus kind of a single consultant or something similar. The specificity of looking for those high value or high importance and impact vulnerabilities that are always going to be somewhat in systems over time. And those things really ring true in terms of the results and what you were talking about there as well. Daniel, as somebody who's looked at a number of different elements of the maturity of organizations and some of the specifics around how to think about the broader security posture, what's your perspective on what's going to happen with crowdsourced vulnerability assessment and bug bounties in the coming years?
Yeah, I think it becomes another tool in the toolbox, essentially. It becomes something that you add on top of whatever else you're doing. Because, I mean, companies have different types of problems, right? So some companies don't have a finding vulnerabilities problem, right? There's a lot of companies you go and talk to and you say, hey, do you have this issue where you don't have enough vulnerabilities? And they say, no, absolutely not. Their problem is, say, remediation. Other companies, like we've talked about earlier, they've kind of gone through that process multiple times in multiple different ways, and they could use an additional tool to look at that. I mean, I think the longest term version is kind of what Google has been doing for years, which is every piece of code that's about to go to production is tested with every single vulnerability or every single attack that's ever been thrown at them. So they have this engine that tests every piece of code with everything they've ever seen. So it's like where are you in that maturity model? What tools do you have, and which tools do you apply at what point based on your needs and based on where you are in that cycle?
Perfect. And interesting, we've been taking some questions in the question panel here within the presentation environment. And one of the ones that came up here, Daniel, might be interesting for you to comment on is there a kind of a checklist that pen testers or people who are in the crowd doing bug bounties can look at in terms of IoT vulnerability assessment and discovery? Is there anything that's been developed there in terms of the projects that you've been working on?
Yeah, we have a couple of efforts. Within the OWASP project, we have an IoT attack surface project, which basically lays out, I think, 16 different attack surfaces and then describes the different vulnerabilities underneath each that you could potentially have. And we're basically adding to that methodology to have the steps to test those things. We're basically working on an ASVS, if you're familiar with that, ASVS, but instead of for web apps, for IoT apps. So that's something that we're actively working on, which of course we do within IOActive, but it's good to have something like that available for the community to be able to use as well.
And people can find that by searching for OWASP IoT projects?
Yep, absolutely.
Excellent. Perfect. So let's keep on going here into our next one. Richard, this actually came up a little bit earlier as we were talking about the level of maturity that people have. One of the things that's interesting to a lot of people that we've seen in terms of the Q&A that we've been have coming in is how the security teams and engineering teams relationships build and evolve going forward, because we've seen things like bug bounty programs, which have in some cases revealed a very large number of vulnerabilities that people weren't aware of and caused some consternation within the engineering teams. How do we kind of make the software development lifecycle more secure or deliver a better, more secure product at the end of it through collaboration between the two groups?
I think that's part of kind of I don't want to call it like secret sauce, because it's not anything that's secret about it. It's just basically two groups have to work together. And if I'm bringing you a basket of vulnerabilities, you guys wrote the code. You need to fix this. And I think it's one of the other areas that we get into is that just as the maturity model in the pen testing environment is there, you run into the same exact issue with engineering groups on their testing environment. They may be doing a certain set of tools or a certain process to test code before it goes out in the systems and in the arenas that's there. When you come back with the vulnerabilities, it's always important not only to that, is to work around and see if you're missing a step, you're missing a testing process, or you're not lining up, you're not actually running the application in real time to see about how it behaves and et cetera with that, or you don't have a test harness capability where I'm pulling data directly off of devices. And I think that is kind of the critical area to say, you have to work together. And when I bring you something, it does mean that, yeah, you kind of missed it somewhere in the process. So let's see how it was actually discovered. And that's the great thing about kind of the bounty programs is, yeah, you can get this information and figure out why it was actually there and pull pieces of data and say, hey, this is why I was doing this. And get that knowledge to the engineering group, and where they can actually go, wow, we weren't testing for this kind of scenario ever occurring with that. And let's go back and build that into the process and go forward with that. So I don't think it's kind of one of these things, and you typically don't want to be in any kind of opposition. And if you are in opposition, that's time to definitely have some meetings at the higher levels to say, no, we're not fighting this. It's like we want to help and make things successful at the end. We're not trying to do that. And I think that's part of the understanding. But yeah, there is always and will always be things that are there, especially we always talk about, hey, security needs to be a forethought of the process. And my kind of scenario is, yeah, I hate to be the person to throw the red flag and say, no, you can't ship this because there's an issue. But if we figured this out ahead of time, we're able to get this and thing, guess what? That red flag never gets thrown on that side of it. So you never penalize for not being able to ship because of something that's there. And I think that's the goal that you want to kind of reinforce with that is, hey, we don't want to stop this. We want to keep this going, but we're not going to ship stuff that's not correct. Secondly, guess what? If we move this in front of this, you can definitely get the benefits of this much earlier on, and we're not going to run into these issues over and over again.
Thanks, Richard. Daniel, Richard raised a couple of interesting points there regarding the relationship, but also I think some of the process that needs to be in place for organizations to be successful of developing secure products. Do you have any thoughts on how that's going to improve going forward or could improve going forward?
Yeah, I think the whole conversation around DevOps is really helping this. I mean, the way I like to think of DevOps is continuous practice, right? You're practicing over and over, and it's development practicing over and over, but there's no reason it's not an opportunity for security to practice over and over as well, right? So I think what it comes down to is for developers who are building things, they need to be thinking about the fact that as part of their build process, their content, their code is going to be tested for quality. And that test for quality could come from a static tool, a dynamic tool, a manual code review, an automatic code review, whatever that means, crowdsourced testing, their favorite private vendor that does testing for them. They don't need to know or understand or whatever where all these different types of testing are coming from. What they need to know is that it will be tested thoroughly in a number of ways. And just understanding that that is part of the process of them building and adding additional ability to test to that sort of test harness when you find them. So when you find crowd and you see that it's working, add it to the list of things that you do and just incorporate it as part of a DevOps conversation.
That's a really good point in terms of what we see in a number of our clients who are, DevOps is clearly the major model that they're utilizing, but they're also as a result of that, they're releasing code on a constant basis. And so therefore, this needs to be kind of an ongoing thing. It becomes valuable over time because it's embedded into the process that they're actually delivering on the DevOps side. Jeremiah, I know that earlier in the year you had some commentary around some studies that were coming out around using crowdsourced security, kind of secure products. There was a study that you responded to, I know, on Twitter. What's your perspective on how the crowd can actually be useful from an engineer's perspective or a development perspective?
So a couple of years ago, I came across this story. I was talking to two colleagues of mine over at Etsy, and they had just started a bounty program. They were a few months into it, and they're getting bugs, and it was really working out for them. And then they started to instrument the app to such an extent where they could see, you know, people testing the site and what they were testing for. They were using a combination, just internally developed tools to instrument the platform, but also CSP, Content Security Policy, in the browser. And there was this one particular story that I thought was great. So some researcher found a cross-site scripting vulnerability in the Etsy website, and you know, they got it all down. They're starting to write the report, and by the time the person filed the report, the bug was already fixed. Apparently, what's happening is that they had the engineering team had the app so instrumented that they actually saw the person, what they were doing, found it, you know, tested the vulnerability, and were actually able to identify the vulnerability at the exact same time that they found it. And they still paid them out anyway, but it just shows how like that partnership can take place in a more or less automated fashion.
Yeah, it's a really good point in terms of the behavioral monitoring in UI UX that can help you out with the security side of things as well. See more and more organizations start to attempt to get down that path, maybe not as advanced as what you're describing there, but certainly an interesting area that people are developing. So the next kind of key trend that we're seeing here, this actually came from a personal experience I had at WhiteHat this year, WhiteHat conference this year, where there was a breakout session specifically describing using machine learning to do spear phishing attacks into organizations using, I think it was Twitter and potentially Facebook as kind of data sources and delivery vehicles for those spear phishing attacks. There's a lot of conversation around social engineering, AI, and machine learning as vehicles for attacking organizations and applications and environments, but also using those technologies for defensive purposes as well. Jeremiah, I'd love to hear if you had any thoughts around like how these new technologies are going to emerge, but also how that fits with the importance of how people are still involved very heavily in both securing and as weaknesses within organizations. Sure.
So, you know, I think machine learning, I think behavioral AI, if you want to call it that, and it's just using math at the end of the day. And what we have to realize is that while it's cool tech and all, it really is solving a fundamental market problem that we have, which is we simply have too much data coming in to be handled by too few humans, experts really, that are looking at screens and punching buttons. There's just too much data to analyze to make any really good decisions in day-to-day security. So really the only path forward to solve this, you know, both we just can't throw more humans at it. It doesn't scale. It's too expensive, and even if the humans existed, so we have to use machine learning to cut down on the noise to make decisions easier. So we did call it behavioral or machine learning way back then, but we were using ML type algorithms at WhiteHat 10 years ago to spot vulnerabilities in websites or to do authentication detection and things like that. And then when I moved over to SentinelOne, it was the same kind of thing. We can't just signature all malware these days and expect that we're going to succeed. You know, if you look at the Verizon data breach report, you know, the average malware signature might only be seen for a straight hour. I mean, that's all you get. And so you can start applying, if you have a lot of this data, you can start applying new algorithms and new processes to find what you're looking for, those little diamonds in the rough, and cause them to bubble up in a very effective fashion. So this ML stuff both helps the attackers and the defenders. But fortunately for the defenders, I think the investment is there for them to do it. The attackers right now, the tried and true stuff, SQL injection, various RTEs work just fine. It's the defenders that are going to get the most bang for the buck out of ML technologies.
Perfect. Richard, as a CISO, how are you thinking about these types of technologies in your environment, either today or in the future?
I think from a perspective of machine learning, it's always at speed, and you can get benefit of it from like any side of the equation. So from a protection side, I can look at more logs faster, et cetera. From an attacking side, guess what? A lot of the early reconnaissance and things can be really easy scripted and converted into some of the practices. So it could easily be adopted into things such as, hey, if I'm spearfishing these things, I can select maybe your postal carrier provider. So, hey, are you a UPS shop, a FedEx shop, a DHL shop? I can look at airline ticketing scenarios. Is it American, United, Southwest, et cetera? I can go to the same structure with your cellular services, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, et cetera, with that. And I can look for the answers and figure out which ones are successful, which ones weren't, and quickly develop a campaign to be able to launch against those kind of scenarios, including applications and including other pieces of this, all done outside of the system. I don't need any intelligence. I don't need any capability. And since there's not a human factor involved in this, it becomes very scientific to say, hey, we had more people click on this link. Well, that can lead to something that's along those same lines before wasting 800 of the email addresses that I have. I can use 3 to 5 of these to test across the board very easily and very sophisticatedly before launching an attack at a large scale, which makes it extremely dangerous, but it's not something that, hey, guess what? It's a benefit to the bad guys, but guess what? We should already be prepared for this. It's not something that we're trying to beat. It's just time to market, time to skill on that side of it that's being enhanced versus we should have solutions that are already protecting us from a lot of these kind of capabilities.
There's really ways to actually scale both the attack and defense that you see this playing out. But Daniel, where do you see these technologies having an impact in terms of, I guess, the complete solution that you were talking about earlier? Are they just another, tool that you're going to add into that stack, or are these things that are going to fundamentally change how defense is done within organizations?
I think it is just another tool, but I think it is a really interesting tool. So what I particularly like is the breakdown of unsupervised versus supervised learning within machine learning, and then how that combines with both the attacker and the defender. So basically, supervised learning is where you know the answer that you're trying to get. Is this thing good or bad, yes or no? And that's the result that the algorithm gives you back. And then unsupervised learning is basically where you don't give it an answer that you're trying to get, but you just have it look for patterns, and it helps you ask questions that you might not have thought to ask. So when you think about supervised learning for attackers, this is things like, is this fuzzing attack going to yield RCE? Is this target a qualified victim? Is this a honey trap, or is this a real system, right? And supervised learning for defenders is like, is this PCAP an attacker or not? Will this user go rogue within 12 months? Are these logs generated by a legitimate user or someone who's messing around? Unsupervised learning for attacker is like, which of these fuzzing attempts out of the millions that I just sent should I actually look more closely at? Patterns in internet scans. Unsupervised for defender, show me patterns in outbound DNS. Look at the frequency of outbound file uplets. So like, there are two fundamentally different ways of using machine learning, but they could be used for both attack and defense. And I think we're going to see that being done more and more.
It's really interesting. It comes back to the point that was raised earlier of why things so tough maybe in 2016 in terms of breaches, and whether we are in a worse situation or not. It's about the data, like how much data is available, and then how that's used. It becomes a critical component of whether we actually can improve the situation or not. So it's a really interesting area for us to explore further. So just in terms of our last one here, this is something that we obviously feel very passionate about here at BugCrowd. The crowdsourced vulnerability discovery and security in general is something that's really become incredibly mainstream when you look at the number of government agencies who are adopting programs, all of the public programs that have been going out. But also when we look at our data, we see that 2/3 of the programs that are being launched are actually private programs with selected researchers being brought in based on their skill, et cetera. So I'd love to hear from the panel on your perspective of how things have evolved, maybe your own experience with bounty programs and where they fit, not just as another part of the stack, but how in themselves they're going to evolve this year. Richard, I know that you've run a program now for quite a while in terms of what you've been doing at Lenovo. What's your experience been, and how do you think that things might change and evolve for you over time?
I think from the evolution of a bounty program is that you have to experience the positive and kind of, I don't want to say negative portions of stuff, but the work that's associated with it. So unleashing things, okay, you now have to triage these, you have to get those into the thing, you have to work with the developers to repair and fix, and the repair and fix really means recode repair and fix, not, hey, we want to put a filter in our web application firewall to block this or something like that. There's an educational process, or sometimes maybe banging your head against the wall, but there's an educational process that you really have to kind of own and work with as part of this. But it's kind of a growth process to get to, hey, we want to do better. We want to get better. We want to do this. And I think it's kind of, everybody has different ways to do programs. And some people will take over the funding responsibility. Others will try to adopt the funding back to the development groups to say, hey, we'll sponsor the bugs and bounty, but you need to fix these, and by fixing that, you also need to replace your bounty stuff. Or maybe this is with a third party as someone developing code for you. You establish in contracts the ability to say, hey, we don't pay for buggy software. We don't pay for vulnerabilities, and you're responsible for fixing these at no cost associated with that. And so there's a lot of things as you start running the program that you didn't think about ahead of time that come into it, but at the same time, you keep growing the program. You see the results to say, hey, this is small. Hey, we did really well at this. Let's make it bigger and bigger and bigger and test more and more and more. And to the point of you now have the developers coming to you and wanting to say, hey, we have this new development site that's not even in production yet, that's in pre-production. Can we get some of the researchers to come into it? And now you're figuring out ways to allow the researchers into some of these sites because of the value is perceived by the developers as being so good for them that you're now going, well, do I really want to bring people into this, or how's the best way to share this information with other parties? And I think that's where you see you start seeing the leverage of a bounty program is just once it's been there for a while, the value is seen not only to you, but to the people that you're actually helping.
I love the idea also of that kind of internal economics of these programs as well, evolving over time and adjusting the kind of relationships of who owns and who benefits from those things as well. That's an important point. Daniel, what's your perspective on how this is going to evolve?
I think the biggest thing that's about to happen is kind of looking at the risk equation in a different way. So if you look at risk equals probability times impact, I think there's been way too much focus on probability and reducing the chance of an attack happening. And I think we're just plainly losing at that for the reasons I mentioned above. Like the asymmetry is there. It's just too hard to defend in all the places all the time when the attacker has all the advantages. So basically, if you look at risk being the combination of probability and impact, we have a lot of work to do on reducing the impact when things do happen. And I think you take DDoS, for example, right? If you have a site and it gets melted off the internet from a DDoS from IoT, for example, well, that hurts your business. But what I think we're probably going to see is companies start to do things like having end-to-end fault tolerance built in so that they monitor your main site. When it goes down, a new point of presence pops back up within a few seconds because you're actually serving from, say, 15 or 20 places simultaneously, and you can sort of rotate around. So you haven't actually prevented this Mirai botnet from melting a website. What you've done is say, I will be okay if it happens. And this goes into a lot of the stuff that Jeremiah talks about in terms of guarantees and insurance. It's like, let's start being realistic about the fact that these attacks are going to happen. We could potentially get better at stopping them still, and arguably we should be doing that. But at the same time, we don't want to just assume that it won't happen and then be really, really hurt when it does.
Thanks. Jeremiah, how would you add on to that, especially when we're starting to talk about some of those issues that Daniel was raising in terms of the role that certain aspects like assurance, et cetera, can play in this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think in the era of cyber insurance, the entire model, the way the InfoSec industry is going to change. So when a business goes and gets cyber insurance, the cyber insurer is going to tell the customer what security controls they have in place, what you should buy, and exactly when. They'll tell you what firewalls to buy, what DLP to buy, what anti-DDoS to buy, and more than that, they're going to have data that says this stuff works better than InfoSec ever could, because they're going to be the ones left holding the bag. So all of a sudden, our incentives start getting aligned. It's not going to be the end-all, be-all, but it's going to start pointing us in the right direction and get very risk management oriented and very data heavy. When it comes to the bug bounty market in general, perhaps it going mainstream, I'm particularly excited about it, to be honest. I've been waiting for this for a long time for it to really take hold. And so when you had that metric that said 2/3 of the bounty programs that are out there are private, that means in not too long, we're going to see 2 times more at least, or 3 times more new bounty programs that are made public over time, because as we know, a company, when they're getting ready for bug bounty, they're more comfortable doing it privately, and then eventually they go it public. So this is going to be really cool for the bounty hunters and new people coming into the space. One of the top questions that are out there is that, how do I break into security? How do I start getting my skills and building my resume? And one great way to do that is with bounty. And the more bounties that are out there, the higher the prices per bug. This is going to be a really good thing for everybody. Personally, I can't wait to see it.
I wonder if that's, Paul, is that you?
Sorry, yeah, there was a challenge on the line there for a moment. So just as we kind of come to the end of our content here, I'd love to get from each of you a quick perspective on what you think the major thing that's going to be interesting in 2017 in terms of cybersecurity will be. We've obviously talked a lot about the trends that we've come up with here, but from each of you, maybe we could hear what you think the big thing that will be in 2017 and how people should think about that. Daniel, maybe we'll start with you.
Sure, yeah, like I said, I really think that there's going to be a lot of focus on reducing impact to reduce risk. I also think that sort of the sources of improvement for IoT and for, well, specifically IoT, are going to come from 3 locations. They're going to come from, 1, consumers demanding more security from the bottom up. It's going to come from manufacturers realizing that they need to clean up their own sort of backyards. And I think a lot of that will come to some of the stuff Jeremiah is talking about. But similar to like what happened with Volvo, where they realized as a vendor that they could make money and become more active in the market by pushing safety as a fundamental feature. That'll kind of help in the middle. And then finally, of course, we'll probably see a lot more regulation pushing down. So if you combine the bottom-up demand for security, the middle across sort of raising of the bar internally by industry, and then the top-down approach from government requiring more secure devices, I'm hoping we will see some improvements. I unfortunately think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better, but I think those are the sources of improvement.
Jeremiah, do you feel as pessimistic, I guess, a little bit as Daniel there over the short term, and then we get there, or what's your perspective on what happens in 2017?
Danny and I always go back and forth on different topics and things like that. I think I always, as a general rule in life, always follow the money. There's that phrase that says the answer to 9 questions out of 10 is money. So when it comes to InfoSec, computer security, where is that? Right now, there's two places that I'm looking at for those things, and one is ransomware. It's a market that's taking off rapidly. I'm looking at all different metrics that point that direction. So ransomware is going to be the bane of our existence, very easy, very effective, very lucrative. That's going to also give rise to extortion-based DDoS attacks and things like that. And the other one, as I mentioned earlier, is in cyber insurance. It's the fastest growing part of the market right now, 60 to 70% annual growth. And that's going to start controlling the budgets of the organization. So once the insurers figure out that they control security budgets, that will rearrange on what security vendors get to sell what and to who. So those are going to be two big movers. And then, of course, is in all of this, a lot of times in InfoSec, we just end up being janitors, cleaning up the old legacy stuff, because as an industry, we're terrible at being proactive, so we have to clean up legacy. So those that end up winning the market are those that can figure out how to best manage the risk of legacy that's out there, which could be firewalls, could be web application firewalls, could be RASP. No one really knows for sure, but those are the areas that I get really interested in.
Yeah, it's an interesting one in terms of the jet we have from a security perspective. It's still there as much as in development. And Richard, finally with you, just briefly, what do you see as the major things in your world this year?
So I think this is kind of the year of the fork in the road, and it can go kind of either direction depending on kind of what really happens. I can see the one fork you're driven to kind of if you can't solve the problems yourselves and you continue to have these huge breaches, and I do expect $1 billion kind of breach to happen this year, that you're going to be forced to do it through regulation and in compliance, just flat out strained. That's going to cause massive issues that's along those lines. Or I think it's going to be the other side of it to say, okay, this is the year of hard work. You've got a lot of stuff that needs to be fixed. You not only have that, you have a lot of people to educate. You have a lot of areas to focus on and shift your focus from what you normally are doing to more of a risk kind of environment to say, hey, we want to be able to look at these key areas, and this is what is going to cost our business its business. And I think you really have to make the determinations based on those areas. And that's why I said, I don't know which direction it's going to go, but somewhere along the line, we're going to be driven in one of those directions. And you can kind of plan for it, but I think we're kind of all on the same bus. I don't think it's all one person that's going to be the responsible party for this. I think it's across the board.
You addressed actually as a group. You've addressed most of the questions that we've had as we've gone through this. But one that's really interesting to what you just mentioned there, Richard, was regulation. And we've had multiple people who are interested in the opinion of the panel in terms of whether the new administration that's going to be coming in is going to be positive or negative in terms of its impact on security. And I guess you could look at that in a variety of different ways. Deregulation in general of things could be a key trend of the administration. Could be just in specific cybersecurity regulation or policy that comes through. Jeremiah, quickly, your thoughts on whether the new administration is going to be positive or negative for what we're doing?
Yeah, who knows really? Whether the whether administration, the previous or the future one, is going to be able to help. If I was advising any company, any individual, don't wait for them. Figure out your risks and take care of your risks yourself. Don't wait for any help from the government. They're going to have a difficult time. They have a difficult enough time protecting themselves rather than protecting each one of us. So the cavalry isn't coming. Stick to your colleagues, listen to webcasts like this, read articles, and then focus internally, because that's where your best efforts are going to be, best efforts and the best investment in your intention span.
Perfect. And
I would add to that real quick that basically predicting what this next administration is going to do is not a great idea. It doesn't seem to be an effective thing to do. And also, deregulating IoT security is also probably not the best idea. But other than that, it's really hard to say.
Good point. So one last question before we close things out, because this is something that has come up in this call and a number of other ones. We're obviously here in the auspices of the bug crowd, crowdsourced security model, bug bounties, etc. One of the biggest questions we often get is, or concerns we get, is people being afraid of having researchers do this type of work, having outsiders do that. Richard, maybe if we can start with you, a quick answer on, why should people be comfortable with allowing external people to drive some of their discovery?
I think it's part of the thing. You need experts, and you'd rather have an expert that you have things like NDAs disclosed with and anything else than someone from the outside that's there. If you're putting something on the internet, you're exposing it to everyone. So if you're kind of saying, well, I'm the expert in this, maybe you are, maybe you're not. Maybe your person does have 30 years of experience that's doing this on a regular daily basis. Or maybe, no, it's a contractor that's got a book and learned something, got certified and came up, and then this is his second major job. You really are looking for people that are the experts, and you can't do it all. It's kind of the same thing as like crowdsourcing. We've seen it time and time again, has always been able to produce results. And this is the perfect opportunity to have something that is definitely results driven and produced for you in a contained manner that's across the board.
Perfect. And Jeremiah, I know you had a great quote in a video that we did with you recently around you don't get to choose who hacks on your website. What's your perspective on this?
It's an emotional reality that a lot of people get over. They got over it in pen testing when you brought in the consultants to test your sites. You brought in an outsider to find vulnerabilities. The market got over that and they did it, and that took hold. And then the software as a service vendors took hold for vulnerability assessment, and they said, wait a minute, you want to test our site for vulnerabilities and store the vulns remotely? It was an economically advantageous model, and people got over that concern. And while the concern is valid, we understand it with bounty. You're telling me you want us to expose our system to everyone and allow everyone to legally hack on our website? You're out of your mind. And at some point, they make the realization, like was pointed out, that people are going to do it anyway. And the only choice you have to make is if you're willing to pay a little bit of money to get those vulnerabilities disclosed to you ahead of time. So everybody will get over this eventually. It's going to take a little time, but I haven't heard of any of the catastrophes that everybody said would happen with the bug bounty programs. There's over 1,000 programs out there, and it seems like every single one of them is going just fine. So it's just, we'll get over it emotionally, and this will be the model that'll take hold.
Perfect. Thanks for that. And I just want to thank all of the panel, Daniel, Jeremiah, and Richard, for joining us this morning. This has been really interesting and really provides a lot of insight in terms of what's happening both within the security industry in general and also specifically within the crowdsourced security and bug bounty environment. So again, thanks everyone for joining. We will share this presentation after to all of those who registered and attended, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.